Question: is it possible that psychiatry's medication-based standard of care is actually causing people to become psychiatrically disabled? Is it possible, in other words, that the treatment is making people sick? That comes from a brand new book that I just devoured, written by Laura Delano. The title is Unshrunk, a story of psychiatric treatment resistance. Laura, welcome. Congratulations. It's a must read, and I really appreciate the emotion, the time, the effort that you put into this, a multi-year project, obviously.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's good to be here.
I normally skip the quotes at the beginning of books. In fact, I've written a couple of books myself. Maybe I need to do that. I never add one of those quotes at the outset, but you had one that stopped me in my tracks. Hippocrates, in women, blood collected in the breasts indicates madness. Why did you go with that?
Oh, I love that question. At the end of the day, my story of getting psychiatrized, as I like to put it, as a teenage girl, spending my most formative years as a psychiatric patient, was about my kind of fiery, angry, defiant emotions as a adolescent girl. That's what got me sucked in. And so it's why I picked the cover that I picked. It's certainly why I picked that quote.
You were diagnosed at a young age with bipolar disorder. You embraced the promises of psychopharmaceutical solutions. Yours was a 14-year ordeal. From 13 to 27, you were, as you describe, a professional psychiatric patient. Now it's been 14 years since you last took a psychiatric drug. And to those who are listening to us, to those who might be watching us who've not yet read the book, they're probably thinking, aha, she was misdiagnosed. But that's not what you argue. True?
True. And I hear that all the time. And I find myself in this interesting position where I'm defending basically the accuracy of these diagnoses I was given. I was accurately diagnosed according to the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I met the criteria for numerous diagnoses. The point I'm trying to make is that framework no longer feels relevant for me or useful for me.
It begins when you're 13, you're in the 8th grade, and you're looking in the mirror. What happened?
I kept looking deeper and deeper into my eyes and had this, and there I was, this 8th grade girl at an all-girls private school in Greenwich, Connecticut. I had a lot of pressure on my shoulders. I was middle school president. I was a good student, good athlete, and I just kept looking deeper and deeper into my eyes until eventually I had this kind of out-of-body experience where everything went black around me. I lost touch with space and time, and I just kept staring at this girl in the mirror until I realized, this is a stranger. Who is she? And then I realized, who am I? I don't have a real self. I must just be a programmed robot performing in school and sports. But who am I really? I don't think I have a real self.
That begins a path that would eventually include many different professionals, mental health professionals, 4 hospitalizations, 1 suicide attempt. You go into all of this in great detail in the new book, Unshrunk. What should the initial response have been? If you can rewind the timeline and go back to the immediate aftermath of you looking in the mirror and having that experience, what would the treatment path have been, according to Laura Delano today?
If I had been in an environment where I could have seen other girls and young women struggling, talking about moving through struggling, and if my parents had had the chance to see other families who'd been through their own struggles, I think I would have been able to have hung in there with my distress for long enough to actually try to make sense of what it was telling me, because the loss of self that I had, this existential crisis and all the kind of acting out that came after it, was really meaningful. These weren't just random symptoms of a so-called illness. I was responding to the environment around me. And so I think, had we seen other girls and families talking about how hard it is to grow up and yeah, what is the purpose of school and good grades? What is it all for? If I think that would have helped me feel less afraid of the difficulties that I was in and have more curiosity about them. But of course, we didn't see any other options. And my poor parents, who had this girl who was cutting up her arms and talking about killing herself and pushing and screaming, I get why they ended up sending me to a mental health professional.
Mom's response, typical, I think, because of the stigma, don't tell anybody that you're in therapy. Laura, as much as we like to talk a good game about reaching a level where we treat brain health as we do physical health, we're sure as hell not there yet.
Well, it's an interesting it's interesting you say that because when I look at the numbers of people who are diagnosed, who are, there have been these mental health awareness campaigns for the past 20 years that were really kicking off when I was, I guess 30 years now, when really kicking off when I was first getting diagnosed. I think that we have effectively mainstreamed talking about so-called mental health to the point where I do think it's really normalized. But if you actually look at the history of these anti-stigma campaigns and all these mental health awareness campaigns, you realize that drug companies and other companies that stand to profit from more people getting more treatment have a big part in the effectiveness and reach of these campaigns. And so for me, it's about, yes, we should all feel free and comfortable to talk about how hard it is to be human, but do we need to then do that so that people can get more treatment and more diagnoses? I don't know if that's always the best path
Laura
to take.
Delano. Laura Delano is the author of the brand new book, Unshrunk, a story of psychiatric treatment resistance. Every anxiety, depression, bipolar medication that I've ever heard of, you've taken. You were prescribed. And one of the things that I've learned from your book is just how often drugs are able to make it to the marketplace with very limited testing, very limited clinical trials. I don't know what I expected, but it surely is not what you describe in the book, that a period of weeks in one or two trials and all of a sudden something's put into the marketplace.
I went through the same shock when I learned it for the first time myself. I assume, having taken these drugs for so many years, I just assumed if I'm being prescribed these drugs, multiple drugs for many years, there must be a good evidence base for this. Otherwise, my doctor wouldn't do it. And you're completely right that the average length of a psychiatric drug trial is actually about 6 to 8 weeks. Yet the vast majority of people are on these drugs for many months, if not years. There is zero evidence base for polypharmacy. So when I was put on 3 or 4 or 5 drugs at the same time, these drugs have never been studied in combination with each other. So I think a lot of this comes down to informed choice. Our parents, are we as adults being given the information we need to make a truly informed choice about whether to start one of these drugs, which might be what you want to do, and that's great. I'm not anti-medication, but if you're not being told these vitally important pieces of information up front, is it really a choice?
You point a finger at Big Pharma. We talk a lot of politics on this program. From your book, the more I read, the more I could see that the personal mess I'd gotten myself into with psychiatric drug dependence and withdrawal was actually a complex, politicized, society-wide mess in which many millions of people had gotten lost. How could this have happened on such a massive scale? When I dove into learning about the process by which psychiatric drugs are researched and brought to the market, I began to understand a big part of the answer. When I read that portion of Unshrunk, I wondered, okay, what about those who do the prescribing? Are they in on it? Or do they believe they are acting in the best interest of the patient? I hope the latter. And there's a very poignant scene in your book at the end. Don't worry, I'm not giving it all away for free, but you're having an encounter with someone who prescribed for you initially, and there's no animus in your reaction, although there could have been, and instead you kind of come away thinking they were doing the best they could.
I think people become psychiatrists because they have good hearts and they want to help people. And the best way we are taught in our society to do that is to become a psychiatrist, or if not a psychiatrist, a psychologist or a social worker. And so for these doctors who spend all these years in medical school and residencies and fellowships and years of continuing education. They they see their patients through a really particular lens that they have been educated into. And I think, I do think, the cliche, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I mean, I do think that because doctors are in this difficult spot where really there's so many other people who can provide therapy. So usually patients are coming to them for prescriptions. They kind of find themselves in, I want to help you and I have my prescription pad. So this is the best way I feel I can help you. And I feel for them if, they're limited by 15-minute appointments or hour-long appointments, and people have these massively complex lives. The reasons we break down and lose our minds and go crazy and want to kill ourselves and have panic attacks and all of it it's always really complicated. And yet here's this doctor sitting there given, an hour max. I get why they end up feeling like their best tool is a prescription. And so I do hope my book, however strange this might sound, I want it to feel like a welcoming invitation to psychiatrists all around the country to come together so we can talk about whether this current drug-based paradigm of care is really helping people in the way that they want it to. Because 1 in 4 adults are on these drugs now, 1 in 10 kids, and yet more people are struggling, more young people are trying to kill themselves than ever before. So something isn't making sense here. And I hope my book helps us all pause and say, okay, what do we want to do about this? Where do we want to go from here together?
I want to read more from your book. My therapists and I operated under the assumption that my emotional and mental difficulties were symptoms of an incurable brain disease for which medication was my first-line treatment, which led me to logically conclude that therapy was at best an enjoyable exercise in connection and conversation, and at worst, entirely futile. Because I'd been told and come to believe the primary cause of my problems was medical, the solution needed to be medical as well. Taking this malfunctioning organ in my skull to be tinkered with and maintained by a trained physician. My question is, the response, the pharmacological response that is part and parcel of today's treatment of so many mental health issues, we've not always been predicated on that model, right? I mean, Freud was not a prescriber. When did things change?
The 1950s were when the first psychiatric drug was basically accidentally discovered. It was called chlorpromazine, and it was being looked at for other uses, but researchers noticed that laboratory animals were incredibly sedated and apathetic and didn't really care what was being done to them. And then suddenly the idea occurred to them, oh, wow, this might be useful on the back wards of where all these chronic, agitated mental patients live. And so that began the psychopharmacology revolution that really began to take off. The modern version of it began to take off in the late 80s with the arrival of Prozac. And by the time I was diagnosed in the mid-1990s as a 14-year-old, things had expanded. Market share, you could say, was being rapidly expanded to include children. So I was the first wave of angry, despairing, acting out teenagers who were told by psychiatrists that irritability and outbursts are symptoms of mania, and feeling down and depressed and apathetic and all of that were symptoms of depression. And so the drug-based model really kicked off at that point, and ever since, the rates of people on these medications have just been dramatically escalating, like decade after decade.
I've buried the lead. You have, as you described, rapidly, gradually, you can explain, tapered yourself off all psychiatric meds. And I want to be very careful because I know people are listening carefully to this conversation and they have family members or they're a degree of separation away. The advice here is not, to state the obvious, the advice is not, hey, everybody, stop taking your meds. What is the advice, Laura, and how were you able to do that? And I guess we should also give a shout out to Robert Whitaker, because Anatomy of an Epidemic was an epiphany moment for you.
It was. Well, and to quickly speak to Anatomy of an Epidemic, and then I'll respond to your earlier point, which is so important. Reading Whitaker's book was an aha moment for me, because in a nutshell, his thesis is that long-term use of psychiatric drugs is making us collectively sicker. And he weaves in personal stories through his book. And when I read it in 2010, I was on 5 drugs. I was going to day treatment at McLean Hospital every single day. It was literally my job. And my life had fallen apart with year after year, just to the point where I was a completely dysfunctional, disabled, dependent, barely living adult. And when I read this book and I realized, oh my gosh, I relate to these stories in this book. Oh my gosh, what if what he's talking about is what's happened to me? What if it's not treatment resistant mental illness? Because of course the treatments never helped me. I just kept getting worse. So they called me treatment resistant. What if it's the treatment? And so to segue to what you said before that, what reading that book and everything I learned afterwards connected me with was that this is about informed choice. I am a story of a child and parents who were not given the information they needed to make informed choices about whether and how to engage with psychiatry. I think many, if not most of us, are not being given this good information. This is not about being anti-medication. Many of my friends take meds and feel helped by them. Many of my close friends are psychiatrists, but a lot of us don't feel helped by these drugs and even feel harmed by them. And so we should have the right to good information about these products that live in our bodies 24/7, basically. And then if we decide we want to come off of them, we have the right to learn how to do that as safely as possible, because it's risky to start a psychiatric drug. It is risky to stop one. Your brain becomes physically dependent on these medications over time. So if you try to come off of it too quickly, you might well face a hellscape of intense difficulties that often look like the illness itself. So they often get mistaken for a relapse. And you're told, oh, see how badly you feel when you try to come off your antidepressant. That's why you need to take it. You don't want to feel like that all the time, do you? So people need to be informed that if you take these drugs for any length of time, you might have a really hard time coming off of them. And because there's currently no safe tapering information available from the mental health system, which might sound crazy. There's so many millions of us on these drugs. What do you mean the mental health system doesn't have infrastructure to help people safely come off? It's really those of us in the so-called layperson community, former patients ourselves, who've had to figure out how to taper off as safely as possible, which might take years for some people. Literally, that's how slow sometimes means.
A critic might say to Laura Delano, in fact, I know from some of the attention the book has received, people do say this, well, what of all the people who are deriving benefit from the psychiatric meds in their lives?
I know many people who feel benefit from them, and I would never challenge that. I think this is, to me, is about expanding the conversation to include those of us who don't find benefit or who maybe even feel harmed by them. And that's not to invalidate those who feel benefit. It's just to say there are a lot of us over here too who've realized these meds aren't our answer, and we just want our stories heard as well. And we want to help other people avoid having to go through what we've gone through.
Just a few more questions. Thank you for being so gracious with your time. I hope you can tell from my questions and my intonation that the book really impacted me. Number one, we talk politics here on a day-to-day basis, right? That's my bread and butter. That's my mainstay. But these issues come up. They come up in large part because I'm very focused on the disconnect of our society, the harms that have been brought about for many of our children, largely, I think, attributable to advances in technology. I have short-term expression for this. I call it the Mingle Project. And I often am making reference to the DSM. And I've often, as a layperson, treated the DSM as a Bible. For example, recent conversations here about gender dysphoria and whether individuals who have gender dysphoria should serve in the military. My answer, yes. I consult, how does the DSM regard gender? You've turned my head, Laura Delano, because essentially you say it's not all that it's cracked up to be. What's the short version?
We assume the DSM is this scientific text and that doctors must have done rigorous research to come to these conclusions and discoveries of these different disorders. But in reality, disorders are voted into and out of this book by a committee. So, for example, homosexuality was a mental illness in the DSM until its third version in the 1980s. And there were even lasting pathologies of homosexuality after that too. It was literally voted out. It was voted in and it was voted out. And so this text, I think, keeping in mind that the symptoms, the so-called symptoms that it describes, might accurately describe you. You know, I met the criteria for bipolar disorder back in the day. I would meet the criteria for different diagnoses today. But what does that actually mean? Because that doesn't indicate any kind of pathology in me. It's not like, there's any link between a diagnosis in the DSM and anything out of the ordinary in a brain scan or blood work. There are literally no biological markers, despite decades of the NIMH researching this. We have no biomarkers for any of these diagnoses. So I think keeping in mind that it's a set of subjective definitions that have been kind of constructed by small committees of psychiatrists, many of whom have industry funding. And this book is copyrighted by the American Psychiatric Association, which has industry funding. I think that then helps you think through, like, when are these diagnoses actually going to be useful, and maybe when are they not?
Your father saved your life, maybe your mother as well, actually, relative to the description you offer in the book after your suicide attempt. When I got to page 168, I thought this is going to speak to many people who are in my audience. Over the years, I've met many parents in similar circumstances to mine with their psychiatrically diagnosed adult children. They are frustrated with the ongoing stallouts, mishaps, catastrophes of their struggling sons and daughters, sometimes even resentful of the ways they feel taken advantage of, but are also terrified about the possible consequences of challenging their kids or taking it a step further by cutting them off. Will their child collapse into breakdown, get arrested, become homeless, kill themselves? Numerous psychiatrists have been reminding my parents for years by then that they needed to set realistic expectations for me, read, likely can't hold down a job, live independently, or stay out of a hospital for too long, might commit suicide. Where, if anywhere, is the role for so-called tough love in all of this?
Ooh, tricky question. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that in my case. And in the book, I kind of meditate on that a bit further. What would have happened if my parents, after college, when I had no job prospects, I was barely able to hold down part-time work because I, quote unquote, couldn't handle it.
By the way, graduated from Harvard, lest anybody who's not read the book, doesn't know that from how well spoken you are, but that's an important part of this equation. Continue.
And so, I do wonder if they'd said, you know what, honey, we know that you are in a lot of distress and you need help, but you need to figure this out on your own. That's what's maybe going to be the most helpful. That could have clicked me in, and a lot of this could have been avoided, or I could have died. Like, I really don't know. And so I think a lot of it is about when you are a parent and if you're feeling those feelings of, your adult child, if you're feeling taken advantage of, if you're feeling frustrated, if you're feeling resentful, finding a way to thoughtfully and carefully have that conversation with your child and name that and make space to explore that together. My parents and I never really did that. I think they were too afraid of setting me off, or, I could collapse into breakdown. But I think having families be more open with one another about how hard this is when one of your kids is struggling, I think that's what will help shine light on what the right next step is.
And finally, how are you today?
I am a fully human, fully human being I'm a mother, I'm a stepmother, I'm a wife, I run a business, I started a nonprofit. So life is beautiful, and I struggle. Life is hard. I'm an intense person. I am a sensitive person. All the wounds from childhood that I never actually got to address once I got psychiatrized, I still carry a lot of them today. A lot isn't really that different from when I was psychiatrized in terms of how.
In other words, you struggle.
I am.
You're still struggling.
I struggle, but I'm fully living life. So, for me, struggle might mean that, I am so overwhelmed with anxiety and I feel so depleted because there's so much on my plate, and I'm scared, and I have this new book out, and I'm getting a lot of, there are a lot of angry people out there. So I have moments where I'm like, oh my God, I just want to collapse in my bed and sleep for hours. In the past, I would have freaked out about that and would have said, oh God, what if I'm entering an episode and I'm going to not be able to function? Now I'm like, of course I feel this way. Like, look at what's happening in my life. And do I need to get some fresh air, or do I need to get off the screen, or like, do I need to talk about this with a friend or my husband? And so a lot of it is about not feeling afraid of my mind in the way that I did for so many years. And I go to dark places, don't get me wrong. I don't want to die like I used to, but I'm just not afraid of it. And I think a lot of it is about the fear we have in this culture of quick fixes and kind of consumerists, like, oh, if you don't feel good, do something about it. Sometimes you need to just be with the dark stuff and feel it because it's telling you important things.
Laura, thank you for initiating this conversation. The book's terrific. It's called Unshrunk, a story of psychiatric treatment resistance. Laura Delano is the author. I wish you all good things.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here.
Yeah, nice to have had you here.